Well, good afternoon, everybody. My name is David Johnson. I am the Executive Director at the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, or CERL. And welcome to the beautiful Annenberg Public Policy Center. This is the room known as the Agora. And
I think your mic might not be on.
Maybe I have to lift it up a bit.
There you go.
This is the Agora, which is the beautiful meeting room here at the Annenberg Public Policy Center. And we're very excited to start our book talks again, actually in person. And we have a fantastic panel and discussion set up for you this afternoon about the release of this Oxford University Press edition, The Preservation of Art and Culture in Times of War. And without any further ado, I shall turn it over to the faculty director and founder of CERL, Claire Finkelstein.
Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome. As Dave said, my name is Claire Finkelstein, and I'm the faculty director and the founder of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. The Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law, which is affiliated with the Annenberg Public Policy Center, where we now are, is a nonpartisan interdisciplinary institute dedicated to the preservation and promotion of ethics and the rule of law in national security, warfare, and democratic governance. CERL draws from the study of law, philosophy, and ethics to answer the difficult questions that arise in domestic and transnational crises and conflicts. There is no topic more directly, I suppose, in our wheelhouse than the difficult issues that arise in the law of war and the ethics of war in connection with cultural heritage. We embarked on this topic a number of years ago along with the rest of the world. We watched in horror with the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, other cultural heritage violations and destruction, the control of archeological sites by ISIS, the looting of those sites, the using of movable cultural heritage objects, selling into a black market to help raise funds for the terroristic activities of ISIS and other terrorist organizations that have used cultural heritage in that way, both benefiting from the existence of cultural heritage financially and at the same time destroying it in other contexts. We held a conference several years ago in conjunction with the Penn Museum, in which our special invited guest speaker was Irina Bokova from UNESCO, who was then the Secretary General of UNESCO. We had some important follow-up work with UNESCO and have managed to have some actual impact in this space, and then produced this volume that we're here celebrating today called The Preservation of Art and Culture in Times of War, which Derek Gilman and I have edited together with a third co-author, Frederick Rosen, who is in Europe and unable to be here today. So we were very thrilled to be able to celebrate the publication of this volume, which has just come out a few weeks ago, with a Penn colleague and a longtime and well-known philosopher of the law of war and ethics of war, and I'll be introducing them in just a moment. Let me just say what we plan to do today. So first, we're going to actually show you a very short, about 9-minute video clip about the subject of cultural heritage, destruction, and Ukraine. While we did not put this volume together to look at the situation in Ukraine, its publication is extremely timely because we are now revisiting so many of the issues that we dealt with in the book and organized the conference to address in the situation in Ukraine, and trying to think through how a lot of what we wrote about in the volume applies to the Ukraine situation, I think is a very important not only intellectual exercise, but practical focus for our work as we think about how to support and protect cultural heritage in the context of the present conflict. We'll then have a general discussion with our panelists and talk about many of the issues in the book, but trying, of course, to apply them to the Ukraine situation, and then we'll open up for general discussion to our audience, after which we invite you to join us for a small wine and cheese reception in the lobby. So without further ado, let me introduce our very distinguished panelists. Derek Gilman is Distinguished Teaching Professor, Art History and Museum Leadership, and Executive Director of University Collections and Exhibitions at Drexel University. He was President of the Barnes Foundation from 2006 to 2013, and prior to that of the Pennsylvania Academy of the Fine Arts. He is author of The Idea of Cultural Heritage, published by Cambridge University Press, and a board member of the International Cultural Property Society, as well as an advisory council member of the Center for Ethics and the Rule of Law. Jeff McMahon is Sacra and White's Professor of Moral Philosophy at the University of Oxford and a Fellow of Corpus Christi College. He is the author of Killing in War, and at present he is writing a book entitled The Ethics of Creating, Preserving, and Ending Lives, to be published by Oxford University Press. He is also a member of the Searle Advisory Council, so delighted to have him here. And Lynn Meskel is my new colleague here at the University of Pennsylvania, and we're absolutely thrilled that she has joined the Penn faculty. She is the Penn Integrates Knowledge Professor in the School of Arts and Sciences and Professor of Historic Preservation in the Weitzman School of Design. At the Penn Museum, she is Curator in the Middle East and Asia sections. She is also A.D. White Professor at Large at Cornell University. And thank you so much for joining us today. So I want to start with Derek, my co-editor for the volume, and who has a wonderful chapter in the volume. And Derek, as you and I have talked about, a sort of standard way of looking at this question is the Monuments Men way, the famous film, which I actually love that film, find it fascinating, but it's put as a dilemma. Should we save lives or should we save art? And should we save art at the cost, at the risk of being less effective in saving lives? And indeed, we ourselves, in the introduction to this volume by our co-editor, Frederick Rosen, also put the question like that. Your chapter, however, gives a window in on a different way of thinking about the value of cultural heritage and the purpose of defending it in war. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, thank you. So first of all, thank you all for coming. We appreciate it. So it is a hard question, and it's approached broadly, I think, two ways. One is in terms of whether the value of life and the value of cultural artifacts are commensurate, and the other one is whether they're incommensurate. So, and that comes out in practical terms, because if you're a commander on the ground, it's all very well for you to be listening to a voice in your head that says, how should I think about these objects in philosophical terms or cultural terms, whether you can relate life and art. And right in front of you is a building and a group of people, and the question is who gets bombed. So it does actually require a practical solution, even if there is a different sort of philosophical question behind. And I think that was one of the challenges for our co-editor, Frederick Rosen, in saying that there is a long literature and many practical discussions on the wars and the conduct of war. That there's the first Hague Convention, 1907, succeeded by its second version, 1945, and then the second protocol in 1999, gives us a very concrete roadmap of how to pursue war. And Jeff McMahon's actually not only written extensively about it, but it continues to question whether things which have been written are right and how they could be reinterpreted for the future. But nonetheless, there is a practicality in thinking about the laws of war. And so Frederick Rosen is coming to actions on the field in battle being in some way pretty clear, at least in theory, to commanders. And the problem, he says, is that with cultural heritage, it's not clear in that way. And he finds it hard to balance the sphere of culture with the practicality and all the rules and regulations which govern the conduct of war. And what Fred has been, in a sense, in the chapter is looking for is something essential about art and culture, which, if it can't be measured, it can somehow be quantified so that you can place it against the ethics of preserving and nurturing human life, and he can't find it, and he's seeking it, and I sense, and in our discussions about it, our there and back over chapters, this slight agony about the very different natures here and the fugitive nature of culture. For me, I simply embrace it because culture is fugitive. There is no essence to culture. And so in that sense, there's not going to be an equation which works. I don't think Frederick Rosen is going to be satisfied. We will not come to a way in which we can quantify it and make some calculus. So to come back to your question, Claire, what I've done in my chapter is to look at the various values which I think lie behind human pursuits and identify several of those which I think are characteristic of culture: the value of knowledge, the value of aesthetic experience, to some extent the value of play, the value of sociability, and importantly the value of religion. So there's another value, which is the value of life, which is the one which is at the heart of this and how you pursue conduct in war. My premise is that these different values are incommensurate, that they're separate from each other, then they can't be seen in terms of each other, although I acknowledge that on the ground there's a real issue for military commanders. Right. So the theory is nice and my approach is comfortable for me, but I wouldn't myself want to be a commander on the ground making those decisions, and I think I recognize that.
Derek, let me actually press you on this a little bit, because I took more hope from your chapter than you did. That is, I thought it really, especially in the Ukraine situation, it seems like the perfect test case for actually giving some practical implementation to your approach to value and cultural heritage. Because here we have a real situation, at least as, for example, as the film expresses it, and strikes me as quite correct, that the Russians, one of the objects that they have is to attack the cultural heritage of Ukraine and render it culturally, and to annihilate it culturally.
Right, okay, so there is a little trick here to do with these different values, which is, although I talk about them as intrinsic, they can often be seen as instrumental, that they serve other purposes. So they can be used actually to serve the well-being of human and human flourishing. I'm glad you're optimistic about it. I think it's very hard to come out with a practical decision. I know Jeff and I talked earlier about an old problem. I think it was first articulated by Dennis Mahon in Britain, about whether, if I seem to recall that when challenged, he said, would I preserve the Titian, or would I preserve my children? And he came down on the side of the Titian. So that's the challenge which we're looking at.
Right, okay, well, let me bring Jeff, especially since you've referred to your conversations with him, into this conversation. And Jeff and I have had, opportunities to exchange thoughts about just war theory. He is one of the philosophers internationally that is most associated with current discussions in just war theory. And so I'm very eager to have his thoughts on this. Jeff, one of the things that is striking is an evolving sense that attacks on cultural heritage really can be war crimes when they're intentional. And your comment on the dust jacket for the book says that philosophers of just war theory really haven't thought enough about the special role that cultural heritage may play in war and in the just war theory landscape. I wonder if you can comment a little bit about the idea of attacks on cultural heritage as a war crime, and does that make sense to you from the standpoint of just war theory?
Well, a war crime is a legal notion rather than a notion in the morality of war. It does seem to me that there is something specially wrong about intentionally destroying cultural artifacts. And there's another category in law that these attacks might come within the scope of, and that's crime against humanity, though humanity is more really people, but insofar as cultural artifacts are treasures that human beings have produced and are valuable to all of us because they represent or they are instances of some of the best works that human beings have produced in our history as a species. The destruction of these things intentionally is, in some sense, an attack on all of us and what we all care about or ought to care about. And so, as I said before, the notion of a war crime, the notion of a crime against humanity, these are legal notions rather than moral notions.
Right.
But what we can say from the point of view of moral philosophy is that there is definitely something especially heinous about attacking and destroying works that are central to our achievements as a species. They wipe out part of our history. They wipe out part of what we have attained as a species. On this question about whether these things are commensurable and what the nature of our reasons not to kill people and our nature of our reasons not to destroy artifacts, one distinction does come to mind, and that is that we tend to think that people have rights not to be attacked. It's very hard to think of cultural artifacts as having rights. So there is that distinction to bear in mind, and that's one reason for thinking there may be some kind of commensurability in the sense that it is certainly, I think, worse to attack people than it is to attack cultural artifacts intentionally. Innocent people. One of the things that I said in earlier discussions today with Derek and Claire, though, is that there's not a simple comparison to be made between the destroying cultural heritage and destroying people, because there are distinctions to be drawn among different types of people. In war, there are the people who are not involved in the war, civilians. There are people who are involved in the war on the just side, the people who are trying to defend themselves against wrongful action. So in the present, the Ukrainians are clearly, in my view, fighting a just war of defense against a war of aggression and conquest by the Russians. The Russians, as I say, are fighting an unjust war. And so I think what this means is that one can sacrifice any number of lives of Russian soldiers as a means of protecting cultural heritage in Ukraine. If one has to kill hundreds and hundreds of Russian soldiers to prevent them from destroying, a late Rembrandt self-portrait, that is permissible. And that's because they have made it unavoidable that this choice between lives and art has to be made. They are responsible for that.
And so, of course, though, in traditional just war theory, from the standpoint of the Ukrainians, they can kill as many Russian soldiers as they want anyway, for whatever reason, because they're at war. But under your theory, the Russians don't have the right to kill as many Ukrainians.
Well, the Russians don't have a right to kill any Ukrainians.
Right, exactly. Under your theory, yeah.
Yeah, under my
your
view,
approach, yeah.
they are not morally permitted to kill Ukrainian soldiers, and they're certainly not morally permitted to conduct attacks on military targets in Ukraine that would have as a side effect the destruction of, even a particularly good comic book. Much less a Rembrandt or something like that.
But let me press you a little bit on the issue of potential cultural heritage destruction as collateral damage now.
That's actually what I was referring to when I was saying, if the Russians are striking some military target in the Ukraine, and it will have damage to an artifact as a side effect, yeah.
So let's talk a little bit about collateral damage a bit more in the concept of proportionality, because so the question is, and this is one way in which just war theory is not focused very much on the special status of cultural heritage. Should it affect our view of proportionality calculations, calculations in quotes, because we don't usually actually put numbers to these things, but proportionality assessments, once we start thinking of cultural heritage as quite distinct from other physical entities in a battle zone?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, good. The destruction of things of value as a side effect of military attacks is subject to this constraint that's called proportionality. That is, the idea here is that the damage one causes as a side effect of an attack in war should not be excessive in relation to the good to be achieved. Now, in some ways, in the current war, I think, and this is my understanding of proportionality, there's, again, the destruction of a comic book is disproportionate to any attack that the Russians might make. And that's because there's nothing good that a Russian attack could achieve that could be weighed against the value of the comic book. Now, that's not the way it's understood in law. In law, proportionality is understood as a relation between the good of military advantage and the badness of the destruction of other things of value. So you're supposed to weigh military advantage against destruction of things. I think that's incoherent in the case of an unjust war. It does arise in the case of attacks by Ukrainians. So suppose the Ukrainian army, in order to destroy some Russian military targets, would have to destroy cultural artifacts as a side effect.
Yeah, that's a great example.
Then there would be the serious question of proportionality. And again, I think to the best of my knowledge, this is not something that just war theorists have traditionally discussed. It badly needs to be discussed. One of the questions is the question that Derek raised: are these values incommensurable? I don't think that they are incommensurable, but they are. It's very difficult to compare these things.
And I should point out, Jeff, that actually it's not just in law, but many moral theorists. Of course, Michael Walzer being the perfect example, disagree with you about the distinction between the jus in bello and the jus ad bellum, and the way that you think about a just war scenario in which one side is clearly in the wrong and the other side is fighting a just war.
Yeah.
And so this problem comes up in moral theory as well. But yet the problem that the example that you raise is a problem equally, I think, to be contemplated for both types of moral theory, both your view and Walzer's view.
Yeah.
Right, it's really actually quite neutral between those, potentially, no?
What I think is that that Walzer's view of proportionality, which you find in the law of war, is just incoherent. And so I'm trying to provide coherence here and saying there's got to be something that is genuinely of value to be achieved, that is of real importance. And battlefield successes by the Russians don't fit in that category. They are bad rather than good. And so you can't justify, for example, killing innocent people as a side effect by weighing them against the supposed good of military advantage to the Russians.
For the Russians,
that just
right,
makes no
on your
sense.
view, right.
So,
Right.
So what I do think that the law of war, at which Michael Walzer's view of just war theory is meant to support and
Yes.
explain,
Yes.
makes no sense. It is just plain incoherent. And so we need to rethink all of this. And what I would say is objects of cultural heritage do have a special value, a very great special importance, and we need to think more about both the intrinsic value of these artifacts and the instrumental value, that is how important they are to people and their lives, and the value of their cultures as they see it.
And as someone who defends the Walzerian view myself for the most part, but who engages with great interest in your view, I'm glad that the problem that we're looking at arises equally for both views. Lynn, let me turn to you, and you perhaps know more about what's going on the ground than any of us here, and you've been so active and involved in cultural heritage preservation. One of the things that you and I talked about is what you're hearing from Ukrainians on the ground who are trying to save their museums and their art. And I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the sorts of things that they need to do that, and whether or not they're receiving the assistance that they are looking for.
Yeah, thank you. I think it's a very, obviously a very difficult, very thorny issue, and also a very political one. The anecdote that I mentioned to you is a colleague of mine who runs a heritage NGO was approached by Ukrainian colleagues, and when asked what they actually needed, they needed body armor. So to do their job in the museum, that was the request. And there was no agency to date, I think, in this country that was willing to do that. So I think we're actually going to be presented with a lot of very difficult dilemmas and asks. And if we do ask what people want, we may not like the answer. But I think what we often do, particularly external in countries outside of major conflicts, is we assume we know what people want and what they privilege. And so the archaeologist and anthropologist in me would always want to actually ask first and not presume. It's also the case as an archaeologist, we have very vested interests in the sorts of things that we want to preserve and we're interested in. And it's striking to me that there's been such discussion promoted around Ukraine with, I guess, a relative silence around what's happened in Yemen, for example. So, we see European masters, things that we can relate to, things that we value. But in Yemen, Saudi Arabia, with its allies, has done exactly what you've described, a targeted cultural cleansing campaign. But of course, Saudi's allies are the US and the UK. So we don't hear about destruction of Yemen's cultural property, its museums, which have absolutely been obliterated, the Marib Dam, and so on. So all of this is still very vested and political. So I think there's going to be some hard questions. What if people ask for things that, in a cultural sense, we aren't prepared to give or have the capacity to do.
And it's quite fascinating when you think, the U.S. has given $40 billion to help defend Ukraine, but yet we haven't paid particular attention to helping to defend Ukrainian culture. Even though it's very clear that annihilating Ukrainian culture is very much part of Putin's object and very much part of why he wants to control Ukraine. He doesn't want it to be distinctly Ukrainian, he wants it to be Russian, right? And so one question arises, and this is something that we'll all want to discuss, which is, the concept of cultural heritage as of international interest is not just that it's an assertion, say in this case, of Ukraine's right to protect its cultural heritage, but that in fact it's of universal value. And so the question then arises, is there some duty on the part of the international community to help protect the common cultural heritage of mankind?
So you're giving me the perfect platform here because you're using the language of UNESCO, particularly of the World Heritage Convention. And I'm going to have to be political again and say that Russia is the chair of the World Heritage Committee right now and has not been removed from that position.
Yeah.
And if you look at the UN statement that we just had, which was a condemnation, we've had nothing like that from UNESCO. So we live in interesting times, and that is because of the powerful position that the Russians have at UNESCO. And so, yes, it should be, and many countries have called for Russia to be removed, it should be part of the international community, part of those international conventions. But I'm just saying that the ideas behind this, the philosophy, the argumentation, it's very important. This is the beginning of a very important conversation, but the political realities on the ground of who allies with who and for what strategic aims is our biggest stumbling point. It's the implementation. We're very good at carrots. We're not very good at sticks.
Yeah, and let me just follow up one more thing about that. So one of the really interesting things that you've been doing is a public opinion survey involved with Arab Barometer in Iraq, focusing on Mosul. And taking the temperature of how people feel about cultural heritage there. Can you say a little bit about that project?
Thank you. So in conjunction with Princeton's Arab Barometer, we have done the first large-scale public opinion polls in Mosul and Aleppo. To my mind, these are things that should have been done before heritage humanitarian aid went in, decided what buildings would be restored, reconstructed, how they would be done, who would fund them. So we asked people, 1,600 people in each city, what were their priorities, what did they feel about the destruction, how important cultural heritage reconstruction was compared to other goals, because many international agencies will tell us it's instrumental to have heritage restored. And it may not come as a surprise, but our results show very clearly that people are more concerned with security, with health, education, employment, that heritage is actually a rather low priority. They are very in favor of it being restored if that is on the agenda, but that is not their first priority. But we're so used to speaking to our own experts, I guess.
Right.
So they are very interested in doing that restoration work, but they also want to do it themselves.
So is there sort of a class critique here? Cultural heritage preservation is for rich people. And those of us who don't have enough to eat on the ground want to survive. And if we get aid from the West, we don't want it for body armor, for paintings. We want food, we want medicine, we want clothing. How should we think about that?
Well, the Arab Barometer does a very good job at a cross-section of society when they do their polling. I think the important takeaway from this is that we ask people first, not presume. And we also ask them what sites they want preserved. And we found that local historic mosques were the #1 priority for people in terms of attachment and connection. And also the old town of Aleppo and the old town of Mosul, the souks, so that both heritage and livelihoods could go together. I think this gives us a real chance to actually integrate heritage into larger humanitarian goals. I don't think it's either or. I think we have to be more savvy about what we choose and when we, who are the agencies choosing this and who we partner with and how we empower people on the ground to do their own work rather than to ring fence a monument and say, UNESCO did this, the UAE funded that, Germany did this, which is what's happening currently. So I think there are some good takeaways from the survey, but we do have to ask. It is about people, and we would hope for the same. If we think of it reversed, we would hope the same for us, that people would actually ask rather than infer what we would need, and it is a case-by-case basis. I think what works in Ukraine may not work in Syria, may not work in Mali.
So Derek, let me get you into this and ask you, so to what extent should local priorities determine how much effort, energy, funds we put into protecting cultural heritage, and how much should we think of it as the common heritage of mankind and let the international community determine? I mean,
right. I'm going to go back into that question. I want to come back to a comment, well, that story I gave earlier, which I think was from Dennis Mahon. It was a comment we made over 30 years ago, and it may have been Titian, it may have been something else, but it was something valuable, it was something treasure-like. So that's the important thing about it. Well, it might have been a Rembrandt self-portrait, it actually wasn't. It was something valuable, and it was the notion that when we started, when this discourse generally started in terms of preservation, and it goes back to UNESCO 17, around it was in the context of treasures, and yet, so what do we mean by heritage? I mean, Lynn talks, quite appropriately about the complexity here. And I just want to underline the fact that heritage is an entirely constructed word. And what we mean by heritage is how we use it in practice. And the reason I talked about different values is because the different values tend to be the things that we go for when we talk about heritage. So, when Dennis Meyer was talking about what would I protect a very valuable Western European Renaissance painting, yes, I would. That was the treasure idea. That was the aesthetic importance of it. There's the value of knowledge, which I spoke of earlier. It's the value of religion. And I understand from the journalism that's come out, I don't know whether you'd corroborate this, Lynn, that the largest category of sites that have been, sites and things, complexes that have been destroyed in Ukraine are religious buildings, principally churches, but also mosques. You just talked about mosques. And so the value of religion, it's really important to remember, heritage just is a word that lumps everything in. And we think, what is a heritage object? But a heritage object is an object we value either for a particular sort of value, like knowledge or religion, or a concatenation of values. So, coming back to your question, on the ground, it's pretty obvious that people will value, if you're in a non-secular society or in a quasi-secular society, or other, the value of religion is pretty important. And so there are certain parts of America where it's very important. Other parts where it's not so important, but certainly in the area of, certainly in Ukraine at the moment, the destruction of churches is clearly pretty important and is moving people in ways that may engage them because it's a church which they are part of the community, of which they're part of the community, rather than an aesthetic work of art which they may not immediately care about. It comes back to this, what's important to our lives? What do we value in our lives? We may value religion more than we value aesthetic importance or even knowledge.
but the tricky thing here is that the local population may value the churches more, the international community may value other cultural heritage. So how do we deal with that conflict?
No, that I think needs to be examined, and it's the way that Jeff is coming back to wanting to examine what is a just war. The rhetoric of heritage, as encapsulated often in the preambles to UNESCO conventions, is the language of of the international world, by and large, and it's also the language of the journalistic world. It doesn't mean that it's clearer than, I mean, it has a greater clarity than that of somebody on the ground wanting to go to their local church. It's a discourse, and the discourse is very much focused around aesthetics and knowledge. So what you're really doing is saying the two international values which prevail are aesthetic importance and knowledge, not necessarily religion, not necessarily the value of friendship, which is what you do when you go to a community and you go to a church, as well as engage with the spiritual, you engage with your community. So these other values may have more weight in the local community. Let's bring up, you talk about Bamiyan. So Bamiyan and the question of the national.
Right.
So we understand that when the Taliban destroyed Bamiyan, that the local members of the members of the Taliban who are attached to the Bamiyan region didn't want to be engaged in the destruction. But still, it's an area which has been Islamic for 1,000 years, and although the Buddhas there had were very well known as sort of great figures which were not valued for, obviously, for their Buddhist value, far from the opposite of that, but they had a presence in the value. Still, you're not going to, you may argue, the argument perhaps in Japan for the preservation of the Bamiyan Buddhas, an international country in your context, Japanese are very engaged in international heritage world.
Yes.
I mean, there's a quite different value that prevails on the ground in the valley. So it's not even when you get to these values, of course, you come back to what's really important in people's tastes and what's important within the culture. And so, the value of a great Buddhist artifact like the principal Bamiyan Buddha, it has aesthetic value. Many people didn't love it. Art historians had aesthetic value. It had huge value for knowledge. Had great value for Buddhists, but not for Buddhists in Afghanistan, because there weren't any.
Yeah. So actually, this brings me to another topic which makes this already complex subject even more complex. UNESCO designated Auschwitz as a cultural heritage site, rather controversially. It has been a magnet for far-right agitators and neo-Nazi groups who value it enormously and hold events outside it. And yet it has been also very much in the view of Jewish groups and those who are focused on remembering the Holocaust, also a place of great importance. And as I say, UNESCO has designated it a controversially a cultural heritage site. In March, the Russians bombed Baba Yar, which was the site of a terrible massacre, part of what we call the shooting Holocaust in Ukraine. To make matters even more complex, Ukrainians were famously very involved in that massacre. It was not just the Nazis. This, by the way, has, I think, impacted Israel's view of the current conflict, because there's a long history of anti-Semitism in Ukraine. And so all of that needs to be put into context. So how do we think of cultural heritage preservation when it's not a site which is itself of, now dare I say, intrinsic value, when it's a site that is important for our education, our knowledge, our memories? Let me start with Jeff on this.
Well, I agree that Auschwitz should be preserved, should be open to people to go there. I've been there. When you go to Auschwitz, you leave with a greater sense of the magnitude of the evil that people can do. It's quite visceral when you go there and see what went on there. There are photographs displayed around about. It's very important to people's moral education to be able to go to see what people have done. You learn what people are capable of. We're learning what people are capable of doing right now in Ukraine. To me, it's just deeply, deeply upsetting. So the reason to preserve Auschwitz, though, is nothing to do with the reason to preserve the Buddhas or to preserve paintings in museums. They're quite different things. One is a piece of history that needs to be visible to us always. The other is a great human achievement, and those are quite different. That is, something horribly evil that is the antithesis of an achievement, and so there's human depravity and human greatness, and the paintings and sculptures are evidences or instances of human greatness. Auschwitz is evidence of human depravity. And we need to preserve both of these things, but for quite different reasons.
But how do we think about the fact that for the Taliban, the Bamiyan Buddhas is not something worth, in their scale of values, from their perspective, it has no cultural value, and indeed it has an evil status, and so we should get rid of it.
Yeah, that's easy, I think.
They're just wrong?
They're just completely wrong, yes. I mean, I was wanting to say this in response to what Derek was saying. What we need to do is to try to understand what actually is really objectively valuable, and not just what people think is valuable. So to me, the preservation of some religion I think is not a particularly good aim, because I think the religions are false. And so to the extent that we preserve a religion, we're preserving something that is a source of illusion. On the other hand, the religions of the world have produced the great art, by and large. I mean, you go to the museums in Europe and look at the paintings and so on. They're all depicting scenes from the Bible and so on.
Right.
And so I would distinguish between the value of preserving the great things that the religions have produced, the cathedrals, the Buddhas, the mosques, and so on, as objectively valuable artifacts, human creations, and so on. On the other hand, I think the religions, also human creations, are things we should get rid of if we can. And so, again, that's the way I would distinguish it. But I think what we need to do is to think about these matters quite objectively. And the fact that people value a set of beliefs that I think are false doesn't make it important that those false beliefs should be preserved.
Should be preserved. So, Lynn, as I told you previously, we don't terribly much shy away from controversy around here. So I step right in it. I usually head for it whenever I see it. But I'd really love your thoughts on this, because I'm sure you have many views about the UNESCO move and Auschwitz, and so how do we think about it in the present
I like your
conflict?
example. Yes, a very, very important one. Certainly in my own work, I've written a lot about negative heritage, and Auschwitz is a quintessential example. There's no other way to say that it involves so much what the Germans themselves call past mastering, that you have to learn those lessons, that it has a didactic role that you can't forget, that each generation has to process that again. So it's you don't put up a memorial and let that do the work for you. You have to keep working on that. It's interesting, of course, that this was one of the earliest UNESCO nominations. And again, I'll try and broaden that out to the international sphere and think about other parts of the world, because it's also very controversial, not simply because of the rallying that you are also talking about, because all of these places can be used and reused in different ways. But right now, certainly the Rwandans want genocide memorials turned into World Heritage. The South Africans have tried twice for a Mandela liberation route that would take on apartheid, racism. So we have other sorts of genocide memorials, racism. Certainly the Thais also want the Burma Railway and the atrocities of the war enshrined. Now, all those other countries that are not in Europe have been pushed back and told no. And so that there is an incredible global inequity that they feel that some sites in some parts of the world are worth remembering in this global context, whereas others are considered more regional. Now that is going to come back, I think, this year, next year, depends if Russia is still chairing the committee or whether the meetings will be postponed for another year. But Rwanda is now on the World Heritage Committee, and they are going to push vociferously to have their sites of memory enshrined. And the reason that UNESCO have given for not wanting to address that is that they don't want to celebrate war or celebrate or inflame conflict further. So we do walk this diplomatic tightrope, but it is also very geographically defined as well.
Do you have any thoughts about, I mean, Russia would not admit targeting Baba Yar, for example. However, and you might think, you know, why would they want to target it, right? It wasn't a Russian atrocity. Do you have any, you know, what's the game there? Is it makes it look much more like it's really about Putin's wanting to destroy anything of significance to Ukrainian culture and history and.
Right, and I think you're right. So the targeting of culture, people's attachment to place, particular religions, but it also started in 2014 with the annexation of Crimea, that the international community, and particularly UNESCO, was silent over, and the site there of Chersonesus. So we saw this coming as well. So I think you're absolutely right. They are cultural places that have been high on the agenda, but they've also been on the agenda for nearly a decade as well. So it's part of his sort of irredentist, you know, plan for a greater Russia. And so culture is obviously part of that.
So I'm guessing, Derek, that you have lots to say on this topic.
No, I don't actually. I was wondering whether this would be a sort of moment to let.
In just a couple of minutes, we have about 5 minutes before we let audience members in, but do you have anything in this area?
In the sense of the great Putin plot.
How we think about Putin's object here.
The occupation, I mean, what we heard on the video before about the premise of the eradication. I mean, he says it, you hear him saying that Ukraine is part of the spiritual, is our spiritual space, which you would have said the same for the Crimea. You know, and you want to say, I mean, are you asking me personally, Claire, knowing that, you know, I have these sort of ancestral ties to the place?
Well, and actually, you and I both do, as we've talked about.
I think we'll leave that one, but broadly, it's you know another mode of imperial action happening at a moment when the entire Western world, at least, is moving against empire. You know, if you were thinking about of all the times to actually engage in an imperial occupation, would you choose 2021, 2022 to do it when everybody else in Europe is thinking about the effects of empire? Well, you know, there's every possible reason why what he's done is abhorrent. I mean, on every dimension, on every calculus. So we don't have to say more about that. But all I'd say in the end is that I feel probably as strongly about it as everybody else in this room.
Yeah. Now, the really interesting thing, and we won't get into a round on this, but perhaps we'll do this in discussion, is that on the topic of negative cultural heritage, as you called it, Lynn, we are in this country, of course, very focused on dismantling our own negative cultural heritage, all the monuments of the Confederacy. And we don't take the approach, well, let's preserve it and use it as teachable entities. Rather, we take down statues, and statues, and of course, there's a lot of renaming going on. There's a lot of focus on other cultural symbols, the flag, et cetera, et cetera. So it's very interesting how one handles negative cultural heritage in different contexts. So, yeah,
just say one thing.
Sure.
Because we had,
Absolutely.
when this book was being written, it was being written as a response to Iraq, Syria, ISIS in particular. And then there was the murder of George Floyd, there was Black Lives Matter, there was the taking down of statues, which we talk about in the book.
Right.
But it is interesting because there's all three of us have different attachments to Oxford. Many of those discussions got off the front page because of Ukraine. But in Oxford, the discussion about Cecil Rhodes is still very live.
Yes. Yes, very,
Maybe
very
this is time
interesting.
to come.
Right. All right. So let's invite members of our audience in to participate in the discussion, comments, questions. We'd love to have you participate. Yes. Maybe you could just introduce yourself before you ask your question.
Hi, I'm Ezekiel Vergara. I'm a first-year PhD student in philosophy. So my question is for Professor McMahon. I'm a huge fan of your work on just war theory, so it's great to hear you talk. So as I understand your view, war and self-defense are continuous. So I was wondering what the individual correlate would be here for sort of preserving culture, what obligations might we have as individuals, what might be their extent, their weight, and how might we sort of understand them?
You're right that, in my view, individual defense and war are continuous. That is, they are activities that are governed by the same moral principles. I don't distinguish between the individual and the collective. It seems to me the relevant entities in war are not states, but people. And to the extent, and I also think generally the most important principle that that governs activity in war is not a principle of self-defense, but a principle of defense of others. This is why soldiers go to war. They're not defending themselves. If they were trying to defend themselves, they'd head the other way. They go to meet the enemy in order to protect others. They expose themselves to risk as a side effect of trying to defend other people. And just as it's important for soldiers who have just aims to defend innocent people, they also have reasons, moral reasons, to protect objects of value, both to their own communities and to the world at large. And I'll just say that in many areas of the world, the museums contain artifacts from all over the world. The museums are not just repositories for the cultural artifacts of the produced in the country in which the museum is located. And so again, this is there's a kind of cosmopolitan duty here, just as sometimes states have moral reasons to engage in humanitarian intervention, to protect people from their own governments, or to enter a war in order to help protect another society or another state. So, for example, I think that if it weren't for the fact that there's such a high risk of escalation to nuclear war in the situation in Ukraine, I would think that European countries would have a moral reason probably rising to the level of a duty to intervene to help Ukrainians defend themselves against this Russian aggression. But to go back to the category that Claire mentioned, I think direct intervention by another state in Europe in support of Ukraine would be disproportionate precisely because of the risk of escalation to nuclear war. But yeah, so I just think people have moral reasons to protect other people, but also to protect things of value to everyone in the world.
Great.
So thanks.
And when you say disproportionate, you mean in an ad bellum sense? Not about
Yeah, the
about
point.
collateral damage. It's about the justification for entering to begin with.
Well,
for another
yeah,
country.
exactly.
yeah.
That is, if, for example, a NATO country were to send its own forces into Ukraine to fight against the Russians, the risk of escalation to a much larger war involving the use of nuclear weapons would be very high.
Yeah.
And because of that, we're weighing the potential good
Right.
against the potential harm. Looks like with taking account of probabilities, the potential harm outweighs the possible good.
And I should say, one of the projects that Cyril is working on, and something on which we'll bring public programming, is the use of tactical nuclear weapons and how that figures into this calculus. So
Well, that's the way it would start, obviously.
that's the way it would start, yeah. Floor's open. Yes?
Hi, my name is Yarub Al-Obaidi. I'm working at Penny Museum, global guide and educator. I just have a comment about what you contribute is amazing and very fascinating for me. I just want to say something about the value of the object, because the Buddhist in Bamiyan, the Lamasu at Muslim Museum is valuable for all the world. That's why when they targeted those objects, those extremists, they know this will harm the world. I mean, they just purposely, intentionally destroy them because they know this will be so harmful. And according to the mosque in Mosul, people gave them priority. I'm from Iraq, and I know how the people mind, how they think, because the mosque is a part of the community, is the resource for people. You know, that's why it came to the first thing to do is the mosque, because gather the people, a resource for food, a resource for many other things to do. That's why they gave the priority. But I'm sure about people of Mosul, they love their city so much. So if they have the chance, and absolutely they will decide about the museum first.
Yeah, so that's really interesting, because you're suggesting the destruction of the Bamiyan Buddhas, really, that the Taliban had the same sort of objective that at least I was ascribing, and we got some of that in the film, to Putin in targeting museums and Baba Yar and other sites of cultural importance, which is not, you're actually saying it's not just to make war on or attack the local value system and culture, but the whole world, in effect.
Absolutely.
And it's a provocation, in Putin's case, very likely, a provocation to Western nations as well, who, will care. He understands. I don't know if anyone on the panel wants to comment on that.
I have to chime in, because some of my students are also in the room who just presented on Bamiyan yesterday.
Wonderful.
Very wonderful. I have to say that I think it's even more complex with Afghanistan and with the Buddhas, that were threatened with destruction in '97 previously, and then that situation was ameliorated. Now, the Taliban couldn't even inscribe the Buddhas on the World Heritage List because the UN had not recognized them. So here's a non-recognized state within a series of states, which was UNESCO, the United Nations. Now, the argument for protecting them, and then the sort of international outrage that they could be destroyed, came at a time when Afghan people were starving, and there was very little humanitarian aid. That was a bit like the Yemeni case I gave, right? That was not on the agenda. That was not in the news. And so I think there was also quite a sophisticated political agenda here to reach the international community and send a message. Now, exactly before they were destroyed, when it was just discussion, Japan offered to buy them for several million, as did the Metropolitan Museum of Art. Now, I wonder, we can't all do counterfactuals, but I wonder what would have happened if those sorts of gestures were not made, that people, in fact, sent aid rather than offered to buy somebody's rocks or stones, as I think Mullah Muhammad Omar actually said. So it was a diplomatic failure. It was a provocation of inordinate proportions. I'd also be interested in how many people actually knew or had visited or knew anything really about Bamiyan before it was destroyed, and that was our class discussion. So I think there are many things going on, and it certainly did get media attention, and cultural elite, you know, globally certainly got worked up about it. But I think there were many agendas, and material culture can do that in a way that other things can't.
That's quite fascinating, Lynn, especially because a topic that we haven't talked about, but which we talked about at the conference and is discussed in the volume, is the responsibility of museum directors and other actors who are in a position to buy cultural heritage around looted items and items on the black market, and the concern that there has not been enough caution, and that when ISIS was controlling archeological sites and raising cash by selling items or renting, as it were, a slot, a chance to loot the site so that they could raise money for their terroristic activities, were we doing enough to stop that being a source of income for ISIS?
I have to say something. We're very good in the West. I'll just say, sitting here in the US, we're very good in the West at demonizing the looters. But I know that there are some thoughts now going to how would we prosecute the people buying the antiquities, right? And maybe they're also guilty of a certain war crime, right? So they're going to be sitting in Switzerland, in London, and New York. And I think there are agencies that are now starting to investigate whether they should be prosecuted, because maybe it's not the poor farmer / subsistence digger, as we call them, not looter, in Iraq or Mali, but actually it's the extremely wealthy collectors of illegal objects who know exactly what they're doing and paying millions for it.
And are complicit in this trafficking,
Exactly.
yeah. Yes.
Hi, my name is Laura Edith Coleman. I'm a professor and program director for Arts Administration and Museum Leadership at Drexel. And I'm also the associate editor of Curator, the Museum Journal. And we did a special issue on the museum response to war crimes. And along with this, this summer I went to the International Council of Museums. I'm a delegate for the US in Prague. And we heard from our Ukrainian colleagues, which was very powerful to hear from other museum professionals and directors about what they'd gone through, what they were still going through, and what help they needed. And one of the things that came out of that conversation was an understanding that our colleagues in Russia were complicit in the actions of bringing in items on behalf of the Russian government, in valuing them, in accessioning them, in storing them in that way. And it's moving towards removal of ICOM Russia from the International Council of Museums because of this sort of violation of our sort of sacred oath to care for our own objects. We don't go and take them from other countries and then say they're ours, although a lot of museums have done that. But basically, I was wondering, you're sitting here in the West and the global North thinking about this. Do you have any contact with colleagues in Russia who might be contemplating these same philosophical and legal issues that, in their silence, are complicit?
Interesting. I don't know if either of you does. I certainly don't. But
my engagement, Laurie, before Ukraine was actually on another subject. It was talking to colleagues, practicing lawyers in Germany and Northern Europe about whether anything could be done to move Moscow off its entrenched position about the appropriation of material after the Second World War, of which there's a great amount. And the thought at the time was the museum curators were very willing to talk, but they were being silenced by the administration. Then, so, you know, that's one thing. Then, of course, one reads of Petrovsky, the director of the Hermitage, coming out in favor of Putin and supporting his colleagues without, I can't remember exactly what the quote was. I don't know whether he said it is a good thing, but it was broadly, he was depositing himself very firmly on the wrong side of history. So the question that I think now is, you know, about whom is one talking within these Russian museums? There are levels of curatorial activity. There's leadership who are dependent for their positions on political patronage, like Petrovsky, and then there are others. So, you know, who's being complicit, who's not being complicit, who's resisting? Your question is, do I have contacts in Russia? No, not now. I don't know whether you do.
It's a great point. It's really a great point. And coercion would have to be part of that, and safety and all sorts of other things. I will just say, after seeing the Russian delegation in operation for over a decade at UNESCO, I'm struck by the irony, dare one say hypocrisy, of watching Russia talk about the destruction, as they were chair of the committee again, of the destruction of the mausoleum of Timbuktu, and calling out Ansar Dine and others. Russia was both chairing and very vocal about that, and who would listen to UNESCO and its statutes when you're dealing with terrorists. So they chaired and hosted that meeting, were the most outspoken in dealing with the situation in Mali, and now we see that unfolding again. So politics, yeah.
Politics.
We'll just take time for one or two more questions. Yeah, please.
Hi, can I just not use the mic? That kind of
No, go ahead. You speak into it so we can make sure to hear you. Yeah.
My name is Jiu, and I'm a first-year historic preservation student, graduate school. And my question is kind of going back to the discussion of value, which you have been repeatedly talking about in the discussion. I understand that there's different kinds of value and there are different scale of value, and there's even value that's a great human achievement or value that's rather fraud. Excuse my paraphrasing. But I understand that, but I also think it's practical that there's a danger in who has the power to decide the discourse of value and who has the power to decide what value is great or which is fraud or not as great, I guess. And because if we are saying some value of some community is not worth preserving today, there could be the other day and the other group will say some of our values is not worth preserving. And also, I guess since value is a subjective, humanly, artificially constructed thing, kind of, it's also pretty fluid. It can change as time flow. It can also change from groups to group, from community to community. So different communities can have different values imposed to the same property or the same event. For example, the Bamiyan Buddhas have very different values in the eyes of the Taliban, of the local Hazaras living in the Bamiyan Valley to the west, or to different factions of Buddhism. And the Confederate status also have very different values in the eyes of people who have affiliation or belief in the civil rights movement, to people who are still secretly, I guess, conservative, or to people who are not even familiar with the American discourse of the civil rights movement. So among all these values, who have the priority if we have to decide?
So let me take that implicitly as a question directed towards Jeff, since you did. sort of reject that view in what you said, and said, you know, look, when they destroy the Bamiyan Buddhas, they're just wrong, right? They're just wrong about the value. And so I take this as a sort of challenge to that view.
What we have to do is to try impartially and honestly to understand what things have value and why. We also need to recognize that we can be mistaken about what things have value. I forget who it was on the panel who mentioned that Auschwitz is thought of by contemporary neo-Nazi groups as cultural heritage site because it has value within their set of beliefs. Now, their beliefs, I think, are objectively delusional. You know, Auschwitz is not a monument to the great achievements of the Nazis. It's something completely different. Again, I myself don't accept Christianity. I think it's a set of false beliefs. On the other hand, I do think Christianity has produced hugely valuable cathedrals, churches, paintings, statues, and so on and so forth. All of these products of what I think of as a mistaken system of beliefs, nevertheless, can have value despite the source in in false beliefs about religion.
Positive
So,
collateral consequences.
well, yeah. So I think it would be a mistake to try to be relativist about this and let different groups decide for themselves exactly what things have value and just say, yeah, whatever anybody believes has value has value. Then we'd have to accept the neo-Nazi judgment about Auschwitz and say, yes, we should preserve it because it's valuable to the neo-Nazis. They are mistaken. But these are not easy matters to decide. We all think that we know the right answers to questions about morality and value, but we're all, to some extent, biased, prejudiced, blind to what really is the case. There's nobody who knows these things infallibly. We're still working towards an understanding of these matters. So I think we have to approach them very open-mindedly, as impartially and honestly as we possibly can, and in discussion with others who have a contrary view. And we should not just exercise power and say, no, we believe these things have value, you're mistaken, therefore. I mean, we need to engage in argument, discussion, persuasion, and so on. So we should always try to be skeptical about our own beliefs, our moral beliefs. We should always be willing to hear criticism, to subject our beliefs about these matters to critical discussion and so on.
Well, that is a wonderful note, I think, for us to end our discussion on, since this volume really was an effort to engage in exactly that sort of critical discussion. I hope that we succeeded. Certainly, I believe this panel has succeeded. I want very much to thank the Searle staff that have been fantastic in putting this event together, as in all Searle events. We hope that you will join us for other Searle events. And my deepest thanks, first to the panelists, a particular thanks to Derek for being my partner in this enterprise now for many years, since this has been a project of many years, and for engaging so much with the work of Searle in this area. And I hope that we will have many projects yet to come in this domain. So thank you to all of you, and please join us for a reception next door. Thank you.